Always choose to talk.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
With wars and conflicts continuing to rage and crises after crises threatening the safety and well-being of millions of people around the world, the question is who and how can we bring an end to all this suffering? Now, for years, the responsibility has always been placed on the United Nations, but it's often failed to end these crises and conflicts because of the very nature of the organization and how it is set up. On the one hand, you have the General Assembly, which is viewed as the world's conscience, but on the other hand, you have the Security Council that's tasked with essentially ensuring peace and security, but often fails to do so as a direct result of the veto power wielded by only 5 countries. The arguable incompetence of the United Nations has been most evident recently in the debate over the US's decision to recognize illegally occupied Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. As Miroslav Lajcak, the president of the UN General Assembly, talks to Al Jazeera, he tells us that despite all of its shortcomings, the UN is the best option for world peace. President Lajcak, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you for inviting me.
Prior to your arrival in Doha, you were in the United Arab Emirates. And just over a week ago, there was a complaint filed by Qatar's UN representative to the UN about Emirati jets infiltrating Qatari airspace. The situation here is extremely fragile, to say the least. What's your message, or what has your message been to the people that you've been meeting in the Emirates and here in order to find a solution to this crisis?
Yes, it's true that prior to my visit to Qatar, I visited United Arab Emirates and Kuwait as well. And of course, I've used my meetings with leaders of those countries, including here, to discuss the regional situation, which is sensitive. And I think the talks I had helped me to get a much better picture about the situation right now. And I'm going to discuss it with the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Right now, to answer your question about the message is to stay calm, to avoid any provocations, and of course to resort to dialogue. Plus, I also believe that the region has the capacity to sort out these disputes, and the international community is worried, but also believes that there will be a solution, there will be a negotiated solution, which will be, I would say, regionally led.
What role does the UN General Assembly have, do you think? What role could it play to make this solution come a bit faster? Because this is a crisis that has been going on now for 7 months, and it is threatening what is the last remaining stable piece of land or area, so to speak, within what is a very turbulent Middle East region. The Gulf is literally maybe the last part of the Middle East that isn't fraught with war.
The Gulf is definitely a very powerful voice. And this voice is missing right now because of this internal situation in the region, and that's why I believe it's in the interest of every country that belongs to this region to find a solution. And the UN General Assembly can play a role, but has not been requested to do so, which is good, I think, at this stage, because UN steps in when there is no possibility for local or regional actors to find a solution. So United Nations does not impose itself on any of the situations, and I really believe that we have lots of trust in Kuwaiti's mediation efforts, and I encouraged my partners in Kuwait to continue this effort.
Well, on the issue of imposing, maybe actually there is a much more pressing conflict that isn't far from the GCC, that the GCC is playing a role in, which would require you to actually impose, and that is the war in Yemen. That's been led by Saudi Arabia and also orchestrated by the Emiratis. And according to the UN, it's transformed Yemen into the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. Children are either killed by the bombs, or they're killed by cholera, or by starvation. Why has the General Assembly not pushed for an end to this war? How much more suffering has to happen for the UN to actually put its foot down and say this has to stop now?
Because it's not for the General Assembly to do so. This is the primary priority or responsibility of the Security Council, which according to the Charter is the body responsible for maintenance of international peace and security. the General Assembly deals with issues when they are brought to their attention or asked to be put on the agenda, which has not been the case. Of course, the United Nations follows the situation very closely, and we are very much worried about the dire humanitarian situation.
So why do you think it hasn't been put on the agenda? What stopped at least the General Assembly coming out and discussing it and maybe even suggesting that this should then go to the Security Council? Is it because Saudi money or the Emirati PR is so well functional that it prevents countries from going to the General Assembly?
It's not my role to speculate. I'm the President of the General Assembly. I am to protect the dignity and integrity of the United Nations General Assembly, and also to respect the division of responsibilities between and among different UN bodies. And as I said, the General Assembly, of course, according to the Charter, can deal with any matter, but the issues that have directly to deal with peace and security should be addressed primarily by the UN Security Council.
The war in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, to name just a few, has forced hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to flee their homes, risking their lives just to get to safety. This has been going on for several years now. You yourself have been very vocal about this issue, and despite the fact that this has been going on for years, we still see video of those crammed inflatable, can't really call them boats, rubber dinghies essentially sinking in the middle of the sea. We still see the videos and pictures of the children washed up to the shore. Why is this problem not being solved till now?
It's an irony that being this a global phenomenon as it is, we do not have a single international convention or framework addressing this issue of migration. And this is exactly what we are doing right now at the United Nations General Assembly. We are working on an adoption of the first ever international document called Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. And the name already indicates what's the purpose: to limit the unsafe, disorderly and irregular migration, and to try to help establish rules so that people move out of choice and not out of need, and when they are on the move, that their rights are protected and their dignity is protected.
That after this phenomena of refugees essentially feeling that they have more chance to survive in the midst of the seas without any kind of proper vessel to take them across the waters than if they stay at home, that despite all of this increasing over the past couple of years, that the best the United Nations can do is come up with a non-legally binding document. Do you see how this is something maybe that makes people lose faith in the United Nations?
No, I don't think so. United Nations is here to set global standards and to be a global leader. We need to help to address the global phenomena and to help the member states to turn this or transform into their national legislation. Migration is, in recent years, migration has been identified with the people who are crossing the Mediterranean, and many of them drowning and losing their lives tragically. But migration has many forms.
Of course. And
of course, people migrate as a consequence of conflicts, but also bad governance and also climate change. So we need one comprehensive view on migration.
The vast majority, I think it's fair to say, or not the vast majority, but the majority at least, is as a result or direct result of conflicts and wars. And my question here is, it's true that governments are failing the most vulnerable. It's not just the United Nations. You're talking about governments that refuse to allow people in. People.
First of all, I don't think that it's the United Nations who is failing there. It's the government, of course, and the conflicts. And conflicts don't happen out of nothing.
Of course, but the United Nations is tasked with trying to solve these conflicts.
And that's what we are trying to do.
Yes, governments are failing, but there is a root cause to these, which is the conflict itself. So surely, rather than trying to look at ways of convincing governments to allow more people in, surely rather than to look at ways of how to protect these migrants from getting from one place to another, we should look at the root cause of it, which is the actual war and the conflict itself.
We are right now working very hard in the United Nations to strengthen the role of the organization in preventing conflicts. But it's the member states. If they are not willing, United Nations cannot force them to do so. What we can do is to adopt the Security Council resolution. And it's legally binding. Is it always respected? Not necessarily. So we really need to strengthen the atmosphere of zero tolerance against those who are violating international law, who are not respecting the Security Council resolutions or General Assembly resolution.
one of the main countries that was a source of migrants departing towards Europe is Libya. Now, the United Nations has imposed an arms embargo on Libya, where there's essentially been a civil war there going on for several years now. And according to the UN's own report that was released in June, I believe, of 2017, it says the United Arab Emirates has repeatedly broken that embargo, essentially fueling the conflict even more and resulting in more and more migrants crossing over. What can the General Assembly do to prevent countries like the Emirates from undermining the UN? And what is the use of the UN if it can't even impose a simple arms embargo on a country like Libya?
First of all, I don't think that it's the role of the President of the General Assembly to single out individual countries and member states. I'm here to mobilize the international community as such to solve problems and to solve conflicts. Libya... But
it's the UN's own report that singles out the country,
yes.
Not,
and
not
the reports should prompt us to address the situation. And of course, we are discussing these issues in the General Assembly, adopting resolutions. It's also the media that can help a lot, because some of the media reports about the unhuman treatment of people in some places in Libya really, prompted us to take action very quickly. So I really believe that we should look at this situation as our common pain and our common problem, rather than to point fingers at each other.
Some people say that while the world's conscience is represented in the General Assembly, the power is concentrated in the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Arguably, that was never more evident than during the last month's vote on occupied Jerusalem and the decision by President Donald Trump to recognize it as the capital of Israel. You presided over a session that saw the world's biggest superpower essentially threaten anyone who dared to vote against it. We'll be taking names, is what the US's ambassador said at the time. What's your views on that session?
I think the session was a message in itself, at many levels. Mm-hmm. The outcome of the vote was overwhelming. You had two-thirds of the member states, 128 voting in favor of the resolution, 9 countries voting against. And the session showed a very strong support of the international community, of the majority of the international community, for what have been the principles of solving this issue, namely the 2-state solution, which should be negotiated by the Israelis, by the Palestinians. At the same time, this session showed that we cannot take multilateralism for granted, and therefore we all have to stand up for it, and we have to stand up for a strong role of the United Nations, because exactly as you said, the General Assembly is our global conscience. It's the only platform where 193 member states are presented and have equal rights and equal say.
Yeah, despite it being the global conscience, it's ignored, because on the one hand you had almost every country in the world vote to denounce the United States, move and reaffirm that Jerusalem is not Israeli. And on the other hand, we had the United States veto a motion at the Security Council, essentially to spite almost every country in the world. So how does that work?
I don't think it was ignored. On the contrary, I mean, both the discussion in the Security Council and its outcome, and then the discussion in the General Assembly and its outcome, were widely covered by the media all over the world. The message was very powerful, and the conclusions are to be drawn by every member state, by every government, and sometimes this moral message is more powerful than a legally binding one.
But the reality of the matter is the world's biggest superpower, the United States, will go ahead and move its embassy. I mean, every country is free to do what it wants, but will recognize occupied land as the capital of Israel, and there will be no sanctions imposed on the United States. There will be no resolution passed by the United Nations to essentially punish or to try and prevent the United States from supporting the theft of land and the expulsion of people.
Look, I'm not a fortune teller. We don't know what will happen a year, 2, 3, 5, 10 from now on. What is clear is that the General Assembly and the 2/3 majority of member states express themselves clearly on this matter, and I think this message will not go unnoticed.
Do you think that the 2-state solution as adopted by the United Nations is viable after what has happened? And do you fear that the approach to try and find some sort of political resolution to what is one of the oldest conflicts, ongoing conflicts in the world, that this is still an option on the table after what the United States has done?
The two-state solution is the only solution we support. It's the only solution that has been discussed, the only solution that has clearly been negotiated and has a strong support of the United Nations and other international organizations. Yes, we are struggling now to get the process back on track, but I've never been confronted.
How can there be one without Jerusalem?
Jerusalem is part of the negotiation process. Status of Jerusalem should be negotiated directly between the parties, and it's part of the overall package. And we need to support this. And as Secretary General Antonio Guterres said more than once, there is no plan B. So we only have one plan, which is two-state solution. No one has ever presented any other solution, and no one has ever proved that any other solution would be better.
The General Assembly set up one of the UN's most important agencies to deal with Palestinian refugees, namely the Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA as it's known. It's responsible for schooling, medicating, and even feeding millions of internally displaced Palestinians and those that are refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Now, the United States is now threatening to cut funding for UNRWA, and 50% of UNRWA's budget actually comes from the US. That means that hundreds of thousands of people will be out without medicine or possibly even food and schooling. What's going to happen to this agency?
The agency will continue operating and providing good services on the ground. And
sorry to interrupt, but according to Chris Gannis, who's the spokesperson for UNRWA, and according to the Jordanian authorities who host millions of refugees, UNRWA is seriously under threat if this funding is cut.
It is. If the funding is cut, I sincerely believe that this funding will be found, and there will be other countries that will provide or increase their voluntary contributions.
Do you think the United States could still present itself as an honest broker, as it claims in the Palestinian issue, if after recognizing illegally occupied Jerusalem as Israel's capital and then cutting funding to Palestinian refugees, the most vulnerable of people, it could still be seen as a
This is for the parties involved to decide.
But you're a diplomat. You should. I mean, you have many.
I gave my answer. I mean, it's as long as they are accepted by the parties involved, they can play this role.
Would you accept them if you were a Palestinian?
This is a hypothetical question. I don't answer hypothetical questions.
Okay, let's move on to another issue, and that's the Iranian nuclear deal. Again, the United States is heavily involved and has been seen as maybe playing a negative role since President Donald Trump took office. It's now under threat, according to some people. He's saying he wants to pull the rug on the whole deal. What's your take on the Iran deal? Do you think it's going to survive?
Iran deal is a good deal, and it's a victory of diplomacy and victory of dialogue. And this is a proof that you can solve very difficult and sensitive questions through patience, through negotiations, through dialogue. And this deal is more than a deal. It's a Security Council resolution, and it's a multilateral agreement. So I do hope that the United States will not pull out from that deal. In case they do, the deal continues for as long as the other parties are honoring their commitments on the deal. And I really hope that this will happen. We have other agreements, such as the climate agreement from Paris, that the United States decided to withdraw from, but the rest of the international community made it very clear that we stand by our commitments, and we will continue carrying out our responsibilities.
You don't find it peculiar that maybe the world's superpower is essentially turning itself into a pariah?
I believe in diplomacy, I believe in dialogue, and I really believe that the best way we can solve problems is that when we talk about it. If you pull yourself out of the process, you lose the ability to influence the process. At the same time, the processes will go on, with or without. Obviously, it's a great loss to the processes when the United States are not part of it, and I really hope that these decisions are temporarily and that the United States will come back to the negotiating table.
Well, on negotiations, there's another nuclear threat, and that is the issue of North Korea. There has been some talks that have taken place between North and South over the past couple of weeks. Admittedly, they were about the Winter Olympics, but many people felt encouraged, particularly as that came at the same time where we had talk of nuclear buttons on desks and whose was bigger, and the drums of war essentially beating like we've never heard before. And that's something that should be worrying. Do you think that there is a real threat to some sort of a conflict in the Korean Peninsula?
Honestly, I really believe that we are now seeing a very positive momentum compared to the situation we were in a couple of months back, when the rhetoric was very tough and on the verge of switching from war of words into something much worse. Right now we see a dialogue. Right now we see a concrete outcome of this dialogue, which is the agreement for the two Koreas to be represented at the Olympics under one flag, and the willingness to talk and to negotiate. So this is a very positive momentum which all of us, we have to support it.
The North Korean diplomats that are represented in the United Nations, you speak to them, what is it that they want? What do they tell you?
I am in regular contact with the North Korean diplomats at the UN. I'm using these contacts to try to calm down the situation and to help restart the positive track. Therefore, I don't want to endanger it by giving any judgments at this point.
But not necessarily about this conflict, just generally speaking. Is there a sense of what project the Korean leadership has for North Korea, or how they would like the world to see them?
I do have the opportunity to hear from them about it, but I don't think, again, that I should be the spokesman for the DPRK. It's you shall ask them, or let's really hope that as a consequence of this positive momentum that we are seeing right now at the presence at the Olympic Games, we will hear more, and we will hear more good news.
Let's stay in the region there for a little bit, and one of the more shocking conflicts, so to speak, or at least from an image perspective, has been what's been taking place in Myanmar or Burma, but we haven't seen the General Assembly so active and so vocal in terms of the plight of the Rohingya Muslims there.
I don't think so. This issue has been very widely present in the General Assembly's discussions and debates, including during the general debate in September. It was one of the most frequently mentioned issues. The Myanmarese situation is very much on the agenda of the United Nations. It's the Security Council that has been dealing with it and adopted several resolutions. Right now we are in the process of adopting special representative of the Secretary General for Myanmar. There have been many contacts and many visits, and we have also seen positive results. We have seen commitments by the government of Myanmar to take these people back. Of course, we have seen commitments to address the humanitarian situation. We have to be very clear and very tough when it comes to prevent suffering of innocent people. And at the same time, we have to be good diplomats in addressing the causes of this situation and trying and helping the parties to solve it.
I want to talk about UN reform here, okay? For many years, we've had many different leaders, world leaders, talk about how the United Nations need to reform. And to be honest, if you were to take a poll of just any street, be it in the Arab world or Europe or other countries, most people, particularly in the developing world that suffer most, will tell you the United Nations does not represent them. How does that work? Why is there no greater push to do away with this idea and to reform the United Nations?
First of all, the United Nations is the best we have. And second, the process of reform is going on. There is a general understanding that the composition of the Security Council as it stands now does not represent the realities of the 21st century. These are the realities of 1945. And the process is happening. It's happening in the General Assembly. It's taking place also now under my presidency. And I made it very clear that I want to see a real process, a real debate, bringing the parties and the position of parties closer together, because there are opposing views of different countries or groups of countries. But it has been clearly identified that among the issues that need to be addressed as a part of this reform process, the right of veto is one of these issues. So it's a process. And again, we can go as far and as fast as the member states are willing to, but in the General Assembly, there is no veto. In General Assembly, everybody is equal.
What is your message for 2018 with so many different conflicts going on around the world? How the United Nations holistically can approach conflict resolution in what seems to be a very, very troubling time for millions of people around the world?
I want the year 2018 to be a year when we are successful in preventing conflicts. We are working on it very hard in the United Nations, and I really hope that we will be able to say at the end of this year that it has been a better year than many years before, and that we have been able to save people's lives, and we have been able to save values and monies by preventing conflicts.
Mr. Miroslav Lajcak, President of the UN General Assembly, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much.